Good evening. Good evening, friends. This is a joint venture between the Bob Graham for Public Service and me. And we have to thank Marianne Vernetson, who's the acting director, Dorothy Zimmerman, Teresa Carnacion, and Jacob Kaplan, who is our intern and done an unbelievably good job. Graham Center wanted me to let you know that they do accept contributions. We're going to start with another press kit. This is the one in 1985. And we ended with the 1986 press kit. This is the 1985 press kit, and once again shows what Bob Graham can do with comedy. So let's go.
Mr. Jimmy Buffett.
My name is Bob Graham, and I love being your governor. I do. I do. The best thing about it, I don't even have to go to the laundry to get my blue suits out of the cleaners. I really don't. The other thing I like about being governor is being able to appoint commissions and task forces. I have a new task force to study the nude bathing at Bahia Honda in the Florida Keys State Park. You want to be on my commission? What's that name again? Okay, fine. Thank you. All right. Good to see you. When you're governor, you also get to write important best-selling books, such as my award-winning book, Work Days in Florida. I'm selling these after the show tonight. Master Charge and Bank America card will be accepted, and they will be on WTBS in Atlanta next week. I love the job. I love this state. I love you all. But there's one thing that I don't love, and that's drugs. Especially marijuana and cocaine. Yuck. I tell you. I say if anyone uses drugs, lock them up. And while we're at it, let's lock up all those reporters who suggest that every hit record is some sort of tribute to the drug cult. My good friend Jimmy Buffett has written wonderful songs about the pain and suffering caused by drugs. Yet reporters like David Powell, who wears trench coats in Tallahassee in May, suggest that Buffett is glorifying these drugs. When everybody knows that Buffett writes about reefer, he's talking about the coral reefs of our beautiful state of Florida. I'm so concerned about setting the record straight on this that I'm going to appoint another commission. We've saved the manatees, we've saved the coast, we're saving the Everglades, and now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to save the reef before they go up in smoke. And I'd like to say that I have appointed my new commissioner as the chairman of the Save the Reef Committee. I'd like to introduce you to my chairman and some of his commission members. Please welcome Mr. Jimmy Buffett.
I hate drugs. And to show you how much I hate drugs, I renamed my band. My band used to be the Coral Reefer Band. Now we're calling it the Coral Gunja Band. Ganja Band. Thank you, God. But as much as I hate the thought of it, those drugs, I love Tallahassee. And I have written a song to express my love. And if the Gov will kind of strum along with me,
I'd love to, Jimmy. Yes, I would.
we'll kind of give you a little bit of Tallahasseeville.
At first, no one knew me.
Thank God for TV.
I did odd jobs just to show off my face.
Driving those cop cars, working the rough bars.
Before it was over, I won the race. Wasted away again in Tallahasseeville. Leading Florida's workaday calls. Not bad, Jimmy, not bad. Some people say Bob Squire is to blame, but we know it's all Steve Hull's fault. Wasted away again in Tallahasseeville. Pushing the legislature for quick results. Some people say Herb Morgan's to blame, but we know it's Dempsey Barron's fault. I'll name a commission
To endorse my position.
We need to raise revenue just one more time.
So put down your axes. It's time to raise taxes.
And then that sun porch will be all mine. Wasted away again in Tallahasseeville. Squeezing out that last ounce of salt. Some people say Bob Graham is to blame, not me, but we know it's the media's fault. So now that I've done all,
Some say that duty calls.
to take on Paula and go to D.C.
But I don't want to roam. I think I'll just stay at home.
and live off of that fat farm subsidy.
Oh, cow, 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 cow.
Wasted away again in Tallahasseeville. Searching for that last ounce of salt. Some people say Bob Graham is to blame, but we know it's your own damn fault.
Okay, where we left the story Tuesday night is Tom Hearn and I were supposed to let the governor know when I was ready to be chief of staff. That occurred, and we told Bob, I'm ready. So Bob says, here's everything you need to know to be the chief of staff of Florida. If we make a call from this office and the recipient feels like he or she has accomplished a goal, is uplifted, fulfilled a dream, satisfied a desire, Bob says, I'll make those calls. One of the things the chief of staff has to know how to do is say no and not hurt anybody's feelings. But the truth of the matter is I got to make as many of the good calls as Bob did. Not everything in the governor's office was hard work. Raise your hand if you recognize the person on the left. We decided to name the winner of the Sunshine Sports Baseball Tournament for Joe DiMaggio, and DiMaggio said yes. So early one morning, we get in a state plane and fly to Tampa, pick DiMaggio up, fly to Southeast Florida, and spend a day with Joe DiMaggio. Bring him back to Tampa, and we go back to Tallahassee. That's the kind of a day that is irreplaceable. It's just a wonderful, wonderful experience. Bob started off like a shotgun. He wanted to solve every problem at once. And finally, he learned very quickly that really we need a small bore rifle and zero in on the areas that we want to fix. 3 areas were the areas that Bob felt like he wanted to excel in: economic growth, the environment, and mostly education. He advocated a state-run, thoughtful, systematic, and implemented economic development program that would create good-paying jobs throughout Florida. Looking back on his tenure as governor, Bob proudly claimed that we actually ended up creating, over 8 years, in excess of 1 million jobs in Florida. For 3 years in the early 1980s, a national firm ranked Florida first in the nation for business climate and for manufacturing. John Schiebel, president of Associated Industries, and this is about as right-wing a lobbying group as you can find, but Schiebel says, a man not usually for support of Democrats, announced that the image of Graham in the business community changed. From fear of the liberal state senator he was thought to be as a governor, who was very pro-business. Second part we want to talk about is the environment. Bob was especially interested in the Everglades. He worked assiduously to provide funding to not only protect what was left of the Everglades, but also to work to restore the healthy state. He created a plan called Save Our Everglades that was designed to reestablish the original flow of Everglades as a river of grass, south from Lake Okeechobee to Florida Bay. Graham understood that the Everglades ecosystem really started well north of Florida's Big Lake at the headquarters of Kissimmee River near the sprawling Disney World complex. His Save Our Coast initiative, passed in 1981, provided for the acquisition of endangered lands along public beaches with bond funding from Florida's Land Acquisition Trust. By 1986, the state had bought 22 beaches for $165 million. The next year, Graham authorized another purchase program, Save Our Rivers, that provided almost $150 million to purchase environmentally endangered riverfront and wetlands areas throughout the state. During Graham's administration, the state bought approximately 450,000 acres of land and water, including the iconic Wakulla Springs south of Tallahassee. The last thing that I think we would remember him for in the environmental area is growth management. When he took office, development was totally in the hands of developers with virtually no control whatsoever. So he passed a very good growth management plan that your developments of size had to be permitted by the state, smaller developments had to be permitted by the county. And probably for the first time in the state of Florida, we sort of controlled our growth. The third and most important initiative for Bob was education. Florida classrooms are better off at the end of Bob's 2 terms than they had been when he was inaugurated in 1979. Class sizes had been reduced, test scores had been improved, teacher salaries had risen, per pupil spending had increased to either 29th or 30th in the nation. While these figures seemed impressive, Graham's vision of education reform often seemed more in line with that of the neoconservatives, such as Bill Bennett, who was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Education. Bennett praised Graham's efforts. Florida has also been a leader in the education reform movement by improving teacher quality through testing and through incentive programs, alternate certifications. Graham's effort to reward good teachers through merit pay increase encountered significant blowback. The teachers' union fought him all the way, and the legislature was not happy to pass it. He did finally pass merit pay, but it only lasted 3 years before the teachers' union had their way. Graham increased funding for higher education, and it resulted in tangible results. We were in the upper quartile of education performance. I think that at the very end of our administration, we got there as it related to our university system, both in terms of increased funding for higher education, very positive performance consequences within the university system. Graham was extremely beneficial to the state's colleges and universities. And one thing that added to that significantly is when Charlie Reed left the chief of staff's job and became the chancellor of the state university system. The only difficulty in running the Senate in the senatorial campaign against Paula Hawkins was how do you run and not give the impression that you're derelict in your gubernatorial responsibilities and still become a candidate, a decent candidate to run against a fairly good candidate. We worked and worked on how to do this and finally worked it out. Never got any criticism that he was derelict in his duties as a governor, and certainly won that race with a significant majority. 2 other items were on that ballot. One was casino gambling, which failed, and the lottery, which passed. Bob was absolutely against both initiatives. One of the things that's interesting is you remember Bob's first Republican opponent as governor was Jack Eckerd. Jack Eckerd gladly assumed the chairmanship of the commission to defeat the casino gambling amendment. We were just spread too thin to beat both elect Bob to the Senate, beat the casino gambling amendment and the lottery amendment. So the lottery amendment passed, but Bob always felt very, very strongly that the state ought not be in the gambling business. One of the joys in fundraising was dealing with George Steinbrenner. George only asked for one thing all the time we were in government, and we weren't able to do it. He owned a hotel in Tampa and a road that was perpendicular to a federal highway. He wanted a red light at the juncture, and it was a federal government decision, not a state decision. And he would call and just wear me out about that. That notwithstanding, he loved the way Bob Graham governed. And one of the joys in fundraising was Steinbrenner would make his box available in Yankee Stadium. Now, this box had a restaurant that served a steak dinner. Then you went out and had a perfect seat to watch the ball game. And then he would see that you got a baseball with the sign Yankees on it. And we probably did fundraising with George Steinbrenner over Bob's term 10 different times. And everybody loved to be invited to that fundraiser. When Bob was elected to the Senate, well, let me start with this. In 1980, when Reagan won first term as president, the Republicans took a significant majority in the Senate. And they said that there were 6 senators, mostly from the South, Republicans, that never figured out how or why they won. And when they were defeated in 1986, they never figured out how or why they were defeated. And that's Denton of Alabama, Hawkins of Florida, Mattingly of Georgia, East of North Carolina, Andrews of North Dakota, Abner of South Dakota. I put this up because I wanted you to see that in the old Confederacy, when Bob was elected, there were 16 Democrats and 6 Republicans. There was also some border states that also had centrist senators. Every one of those senators, other than Wise Fowler, you would consider a centrist, either slightly right or slightly left. And what happened was they were the balancing in the Democratic caucus. That's why we were able to do so many more things than you can do now. The pressure from the liberals finally made most of these people who could have been reelected decided not to run because it was too hard to do it. This is just a picture of the election. And Bob being sworn in by George Herbert Walker Bush, who was then the Vice President of the United States. Next, we're going to talk about Bob's roommate. You may recognize Gwendolyn Graham, and she wants to give you a few minutes about what it was like when she was with Bob in Washington.
My foot's asleep, buddy. We gotta wake it up. Hi, everybody. Yes, when Dad was elected to the U.S. Senate, Mom, who was here, right here on the front row, Mom needed to stay in Florida because my youngest sister had not graduated from high school yet. And so we did not want Dad to move to D.C. and be all by himself. That would have been sad. So I volunteered to move up and live with Dad for almost 4 years, his first 4 years in the U.S. Senate. And I have to tell you all, it was the most wonderful 4 years. I get emotional thinking about it because we just had so much fun together, and it was so nice to be able to come home and be with him and have time with him. And we just had a lot of wonderful father-daughter time during those 4 years. But we also had some interesting times, which really illustrate my dad in a way that I would never have known but for this opportunity to live with him. So I was in law school in Washington and would often get home late at night. And I came in one night and I didn't know where Dad was. And I heard some ruckus back in the kitchen, which was not a place he normally would be. But I went back there and I found my dad over the stove with a pot and a spoon, and he was stirring away very vigorously. He was determined to get whatever he was stirring in a different consistency. That was his goal. And I said, Dad, what are you doing? He said, I'm heating this up. And I said, well, Dad, what is it? And he said, it's pumpkin. And I said, so Dad, you're heating up a can of pumpkin? I said, I'm happy. I'll get you some food. I can find something other than a can of pumpkin for you to eat tonight. And he said, no, Gwen, nope. I can hear it like it was yesterday. Nope. This pumpkin is great. It's here, it's free, and it will fill the hole. And I mean, I have to tell you, that was my dad. He was the easiest person, for those of y'all who got to know him. Buddy's put me on a time frame. He's like 4 minutes. So, sweetheart, my husband's here to keep me. I'm only 2 minutes in? Oh my gosh, I got a lot more time. He was the easiest person to live with. And Mom would come up and visit, and Mom loved it because we also had dogs, which she didn't necessarily like, but the dogs were part of the deal, and Dad was fine with the dogs. And eventually Mom came up, and we got booted out because she became full-time taking care of Dad. Mom, did Dad ever eat pumpkin when you were taking care? See, you did a better job. You got him fed for how many years were you and Dad married? 67 years. And as far as we know, he only once opened up a can of pumpkin as his dinner. So anyway, thank you all for being here tonight. Really means a lot to Mom and me and our family that you're interested in learning more about my dad. He was absolutely the most wonderful man, and I miss him every day. Thank you all so much.
Gwen and Steve are driving back to Tallahassee tonight, so they're excused anytime they're ready to leave. Who here knows who Donna Rice is? After Bob was elected, he and I were jogging the night after he was elected, and he wanted to know what I was going to do. And I said, well, I think I'll go back and practice accounting. I said, Robin Gibson has a client that took a workers' compensation fund from Associated Industries, and it's very valuable, and he's willing to pay you $50,000 to defend him in the legislature. Well, Associated Industries had the workers' comp fund before Doc Dockery took it, so I probably could have handled that in 6 hours worth of phone calls and been the easiest $50,000 I would have ever made. But Adele and I said, all right, I'll consider going to Washington for 6 months and setting up the office. So Bob and Adele and I fly to Washington for an orientation meeting. Adele goes to a wives' luncheon, and at the wives' luncheon is Lee Hart. Yeah. And Lee Hart says, Gary and I are moving back to Colorado. He's out of office. He's going to run for president. But they have this apartment in the basement of their home that they developed for their children. And at the time, the apartment was just beautiful. It was beautifully furnished. It even had a grand piano in it. And Adele and Lee says, do you know anyone that might be interested in this? And Adele puts up her hand like that, and she said, I have your candidate, and it's me. So Gary and Lee become my landlords, and you never see them. The night of the Super Bowl, which was late January, it snowed, and the Grahams were hosting a Super Bowl party. And the snow got pretty bad, and I was in walking distance of their home. So I walked home, went to sleep, got up the next morning, got in the bathroom, shower and shaving, and there's a knock on my door. I thought I was going to have a heart attack because there shouldn't have been anybody in that house but me. And who was it but Senator Gary Hart? Well, what the Harts had asked me to do or said that I could do is not put in my own telephone, that they said all of their friends knew where they were going to be in Colorado, and I had no sense paying the expense of stopping a phone and starting one, so I would use their phone. Well, the snow was awfully bad, and we were dealing with a lot of 23 and 24-year-olds as staff, and they're calling me to see if they have to come to work. And Gary says, would you mind answering the phone yourself? So I had an ex-senator, potential to be president of the United States, answering the phone for me. Several months later, I had gone to Jacksonville for the weekend, and when I went to Jacksonville, I did not want to watch any news. I didn't want to hear about what was happening. And my flight back to Washington got to Dulles around 11:45 that night. I got my car, drove to the house. The garage, there's a alley that runs behind their home, and that's the access to the garage. And I get there and open the garage door, and there's an old beat-up car in there. So I'm thinking maybe Gary's children are here, because they from time to time came, and they saw that I wasn't there, and they were using the garage. So I go to bed, wake up the next morning, and it's drizzling, and it's kind of a cruddy day. I walk out, and there's got to be 40 reporters in the house in front of me. And one of them runs up with an umbrella and puts it over my head, and he says, does Gary Hart live there? I said, no, Gary Hart owns the place, but he's living in Colorado. I live there now. And I sort of shoved them aside, got in my car, and drove to the Senate office building. Well, my routine was to go to the shop in the Dirksen office building, buy 2 newspapers, the Washington Post and New York Times, read those as I had breakfast in the Dirksen cafeteria. Well, I throw that newspaper open and I say, oh my God. It was just full of the monkey business between Gary and Donna Rice. What an experience that happened to be. The Lawton Childs and Bob crossed in the United States Senate for 2 years, and then there was the replacement to occupy the seat after Lawton retired. Bob's really good friend, dear friend, colleague from years was Buddy McKay, who was running against Connie Mack. And it was not going well. And so about 2 weeks before the election, Bob, in a press conference, calls Connie an ideological wacko. Now, that was a really big deal back then. Today, it wouldn't even raise an eyebrow. Even if you put the F word in front of it, it wouldn't raise an eyebrow. That's how things have changed. But anyway, it was somewhat of a hurtful description. I think the word should have been ideological, by the way, but I didn't correct it. Anyway, Connie's elected, And it's the procedure would be that the senior senator escorts the newly elected senator to the dais and the newly elected senator sworn in. And Bob and I are sitting in his office the day before the swearing in, trying to figure out what in the devil do we do now. So we asked our secretary to call Connie's secretary to see if Connie would be willing to have a meeting with Bob and me. And they said, sure, they'd be happy to. We go to this meeting, and no one could have been more gracious than Connie was in greeting Bob and me. I mean, it was like an old friend had come into his office building. And from that, a warm friendship and working relationship was developed. It got to be where their staffs, when constituents called wanting a meeting, they would offer either to set up a meeting with the other senator or have the staffs of both senators at the one meeting, so you only had to make one presentation. About every 6 weeks, on a Friday afternoon when it got quiet, one of us would host a beer party in our offices. It's just, the staffs loved each other, they worked together. It's the kind of thing you do not see anymore. And speaking of that, I mentioned that Jack Eckert, who had been one of Bob's opponents, was happy to take on casino gambling. Bob Shevin, who was Bob's most serious opponent in the first gubernatorial election, Bob appointed Shevin to the appellate court in Florida. And that was the way Bob operated. He did not hold grudges, and that wasn't the way he did things at all. This picture is Connie and Bob with the newly created Tampa Bay Devil Rays. What happened was Bob was incensed that Florida had no Major League Baseball. Here you've got the fastest growing state in the country, some of the fastest growing cities, and baseball is not played here. And so Bob and Connie created the United States Caucus for the expansion of Major League Baseball. This is one of the things you could also do in Washington that's just a bunch of fun. So we ended up having the commissioner, the senators were from California, Colorado, Florida, Virginia, and Arizona. And you never had any trouble getting all of the senators to come to a caucus meeting because you knew it was going to be fun. It was unbelievable how reactionary the owners of Major League Baseball were. I think if they had their way, they would still all be playing east of the Mississippi River. But we harangued them and beat up on them, and finally they decided to expand baseball, and we ended up with a new baseball team in Denver, Colorado, Phoenix, Arizona, Tampa, Florida, and Miami, Florida. Bob's reelection in 1992 was an absolute non-event. He ran against Bill Grant. He won by 66%. One of the things that was an issue or a problem was that Bob did not like fundraising for himself. When he was chairman of the senatorial campaign committee, he did a wonderful job fundraising, but he never was comfortable asking for dollars for himself. He wanted very much to make it to the finance committee, and after he was chairman of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, he did make it to the Finance Committee. Now, most senators want to be on the Finance Committee because that's the committee that has jurisdiction over taxation. Bob didn't give a hoot about taxation, but the Finance Committee also has jurisdiction over health care. This was an area that Bob had developed much expertise in and added a lot to that committee. Bob had near miss after near miss for the vice presidency. He was vetted by Dukakis in 1988, Clinton in 1992, Gore in 2000, and Kerry in 2004. The one that made the most significant mistake, and probably it was a stupid mistake, was Gore. Gore, had he won Florida, would have been president of the United States. Truth of the matter is he probably won Florida, but the voting in Broward County was so screwed up that it ended up in court and it ended up in the Supreme Court, and the partisan Supreme Court ruled in favor of Bush. I never understood why Gore took Joe Lieberman. I like Joe Lieberman, but I don't think he added a thing to the ticket. There's no way in the world that if Bob had been on that ticket that you would have lost Florida. And here's the reason that's important. George Herbert Walker Bush asked the Congress for authority to push the Iraqi army back to Iraq after their invasion of Kuwait. They had invaded Kuwait, and Bush said we shouldn't leave that alone. Let's go ahead and push the Iraqi army back. The Congress gave him permission. Bob voted yes on that war vote. And George Herbert Walker Bush did just what's right. He engaged the Iraqi army in Kuwait, pushed the army back to the Iraqi border, and quit. And it was over. Later, George W. Bush decided that he wanted to go to war with Iraq over weapons of mass destruction. Now remember, it was George W. Bush that had Graham been the vice president that had never gone to war, because Bob knew very well that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction. As chairman of the Intelligence Committee, he had the same data that the administration has. Administration decides based on the data that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. Bob says there's no way there's weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So he votes against that war, and that probably may have been the most serious foreign policy mistake of the 20th century, because what you had prior to that war is Iraq and Iran holding each other off. They both were absolutely afraid of the other, and they weren't able to do very much because they were concerned the other would come in. So that's why that becomes such a horrible foreign policy issue. Golly, we're almost to the end. I left the office in around 1999 and decided I wanted to travel the country. I, like Bob, had been a workaholic all my life. I thought you were supposed to work every night into the evening and every weekend. And I had a friend that I wanted to travel with. And I went to Bob and I said, look, here's what I'd like to do. I want to take a year off and travel the country. I want to come back to the office, but I don't want to be in charge anymore. I want to maybe take an issue and be a legislative assistant. How about if I take tax? That would be a good issue for an old CPA. And Bob says, whatever you want to do is fine, just let me know. So the way it operated is I was driving around the country. About every 5 weeks, I would fly back to Washington, fly to Jacksonville to visit with the family, and then fly back to wherever my car was. And I did get to travel the entire country. But the third trip back to Washington, I'm sitting down with Bob and I'm saying, you know what, Bob? I didn't know there was a life without work. And I think I can live a life without work. So if you don't mind, I'm not coming back. Well, he said he understood, and away we went. This was, like I say, around 98, 99. At the end of 2000, I start hearing from Gwen and from Adele, would I consider coming back to Washington? And the reasoning was Bob was going to be chairman of the Intelligence Committee, and he wanted to reorganize the office. Well, in December of 2000, I'd had extensive surgery on my face. I had a terrible second skin cancer. They had to take almost all of the nose, all of the skin. They had to take cartilage from the ear to rebuild the nose. It was about the ugliest thing you could ever imagine while this was going on. And I'm talking to them and saying, no, I'm not going anywhere. Well, getting close to Christmas, about this time of the year, I was beginning to feel a lot better. And either Gwen or Bob says, why don't I come over and we play golf together in Tallahassee? And I said, yeah, that's a great idea. So I drive to Tallahassee. It was a terrible day. We didn't get to play golf, but we got to spend the day together. And I said, look, here's what I'll do. If I can come back to Washington in April, and then we're talking about 2001, and leave in November, I'm happy to come back and reorganize the office. And of course, I'm choosing those dates because I'm a baseball fan. And it's so easy to get to Baltimore, to Camden Yards to see the Orioles. I got to see baseball any night I wanted to. It probably took me all of 4 weeks to make the adjustments to the office that needed to be made and hire my successor and hire his assistant. And so I'm playing golf 2-3 times a week. I have a ball because no sense me being there when my successor's trying to learn the job. So it's all fine. That's until 9/11. That was the strangest day I've ever seen in my life. Having been a naval officer and lived on a ship for well over 3 years, you spend all your time on that ship training for emergencies. That's all you do. It's incredibly important. But the capital of the United States had absolutely no emergency procedures, none whatsoever. That morning, Bob was having breakfast in the Senate dining room with the head intelligence officer of Pakistan, and we were in his Capitol office. Once you have seniority, senators get a second office in the Capitol, that's close to the floor, and that's where we were waiting for Bob to have our meeting that we have every morning to discuss the day's events. And we're watching television, and they're showing that airplane hitting the center, and you say, nobody could fly that poorly. And then when you see the second one, you know we've got a horrible problem. Well, the Capitol Police, all they could do is run through the buildings and say, get out of the buildings, because we're afraid that you're going to be attacked. So that was their emergency procedure, running everybody out of the buildings. It was just a strange day, not knowing what we were supposed to be doing or why. And I sort of hope that the Capitol now has adopted emergency procedures, because they certainly weren't there in 2001. The other thing that occurred when I went back to Washington in 2001 was as follows. The Florida Senate, or the Florida legislature, had decided to do away with the Board of Regents, which is the governing body of the state university system. They could do this because the Board of Regents were statutorily created. And the reason they wanted to do away with this, the Board of Regents, was John Thrasher, who was the then president of the Florida Senate and the leader, an FSU graduate, wanted very much to establish a medical school at FSU. The regents had said no, and the legislature initially had said no. Then Thrasher comes up with the idea that maybe what we really need is a medical school in Tallahassee and a law school for Florida A&M in Orlando, that putting together the Republicans and the African American members of the legislature, giving them enough vote to create both those schools. Bob was absolutely incensed. He could not believe that this was happening. And he said, "What do we do about it?" "I have no idea, Senator." He says, "Well, what we're going to do about it is we're going to create a governing system in the Constitution. We'll pass a Constitution amendment." And I said, "Do you know how?" And he says, "No." I said, "I don't either." I said, "Why don't we call Robin?" Robin always had the first shot at what we needed. So I call Robin, and he says, "It just so happens that I have a client that passed the high-speed rail constitutional amendment. His name is Doc Dockery." I said, "Well, how about getting with Doc and see if he can help us figure out how to create a governing system for the state university system?" So he calls Doc, and Doc says, "Here's what you have to do. There's 3 things. You have to hire David Hill to do your polling. He's an outstanding pollster. You have to hire this outfit to help you accumulate the signatures you need to get on the ballot. And then you need to hire this outfit to help you raise funds. If you do that, it's going to be all right." Well, Robin and our former general counsels get together and they create the constitutional amendment. When you pass a constitutional amendment, you need to create a 75-word synopsis of what the amendment does. And that's what goes on the ballot, so people have an idea what they're voting about. So they get together and they put the 75-word synopsis together, and Hill says, "Well, let me do a focus group to see how that would do." So David Hill convenes a focus group in Tampa, Florida, and runs the synopsis by the focus group. And at the end of that, he says, "If we put this on the ballot, you're going to lose 70-30. So we said, "Well, what do we do?" David says, "Let me write the synopsis for you," which he did. And we decided, David says, "Let's focus group this thing a second time." So we do the focus group in Orlando, and this one I fly down because I wanted to watch. And at the end of it, David says, "You're going to pass this constitutional amendment by probably around 60.5% to 39.5%. And he says, "If you want further proof, maybe I ought to do a poll." So we said, "Sure, we're in for a penny, we're in for a pound, go ahead and poll." Comes back with the exact same information. One of the issues was David Hill was a Republican and all of his clients were Republicans. He took on our issue because he believed in it. So he says, "Look, if this thing becomes partisan in any way," he says, "I've got to bail out because the other folks are the ones that hire me." So we said, "Sure, that's all right." It did become partisan. People in Tallahassee were sniping at Bob, sniping at us. We're all writing op-ed pieces. We're all going to the editorial boards to explain what we're trying to do. And in fact, we passed the constitutional amendment, just as this thing says, 60.5 to 39.5. That somewhat ends what I've got to say, maybe with one other thing. Let me just throw this in. The notebook. This was Bob's management tool, and he did it well. He absolutely knew how to take the notes, pass them on to the appropriate staff, respond to constituents, etc. Absolutely, he had learned that from his father, who managed the dairy that way. The press, which he loved and which he loved to interact with, and the outstanding press corps in Florida and in Washington. They loved to banter with him, and he loved to banter back with them. However, they can't give you a total free pass. So some of them start saying that the utilization of these notebooks was quirky. And that got around, and that always bothered me that maybe that's why Gore was afraid of taking Bob. It made no sense, because here's a man as stable as he can be, a magnificent governor of Florida. There wasn't a thing quirky about the notebooks, and there wasn't a thing quirky about Bob Graham. And the United States is a loser because of that. Thank you, folks. If anybody needs to get out of here, go. If anybody wants to see if I can answer their questions, there's probably a 50-50 chance that I can.
Sure. What would you say is one of Bob's most characteristic or features as a public servant?
Well, to me, the most important thing, and I said it Tuesday night, is Bob took his responsibilities seriously, but didn't take himself seriously. That wasn't somebody that takes himself seriously.
But did Gore win Florida, and should he have been president?
My guess is, had they counted the votes right, had they hit the ballots right in Broward County, Gore would have won with Lieberman. The point I'm making is if Bob was on the ticket, it wouldn't have mattered how they punched the ballots. Graham would have won Florida.
I have one anecdote to add about Bob. I ran into Bob and Adele coming out of the elevator in Building 1. This is about 4 years ago. And I had a friend with me from the country of Colombia. And she was so awestruck by having an opportunity to meet Bob Graham and Adele that she hardly knew what to say. And when he found out she was from Colombia, he immediately switched and was speaking Spanish to her. And she was trying to figure out why his English sounded so funny. And after they left, her daughter said to her, "Mom, what happened to you?" And she said, "I didn't know he was speaking Spanish. I never dreamed he would." But that was Bob Graham.
One of the things that I meant to point out is that Bob wore these kind of funky ties with the outline of the state of Florida and in one color and the background in another color. But these things became popular throughout the state. All of us owned one, all of us owned more than one. We wore them considerably. Everybody was wearing them. There it is. There's the tie I'm talking about. If Bob was President Trump, he would have wanted a royalty for people wearing those ties.
I could say that Bob Graham and Adele were opposite me in my apartment, and I have never seen such devoted daughters as Bob Graham's daughters. And I know Adele did a great job. Bob was a marvelous person.
You missed or didn't hear what I said Tuesday night when we did the celebration of life for Bob in Miami Lakes. And in the evening, I walked outside, and the grandchildren were all there, 11 of them, siblings and first cousins of each other. And I've never seen a group of 11 people that so obviously were total in love with each other. So that has a lot to do with what Adele did in raising those families. But you're right, the girls are devoted, the grandchildren are devoted. Thank you.
Thank you so much, buddy. Thank you.
All the way, we've got a friend in Bob Graham. That's what everybody's saying. All the way from Key West town to Tampa Bay, from good old Pensacola, Jacksonville down to Daytona. Bob's working for Florida's future every day. Bob Graham is a cracker. Be a Graham cracker backer. Let's keep Graham